Good morning, everyone. I'm Rupi Rai. Apologies for the delay. Welcome to our webinar today. This is the fifth webinar in the PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa series. I'm welcoming you today from Washington, D.C. And our topic is the institutional quality and impact on PPP implementation in Kenya. The series is jointly hosted by the Open Learning Campus, the PPP Unit Kenya, and the World Bank PPP Group. In today's webinar, we will focus on gaining an understanding of PPP institutions and their impact on project implementation. And much like in our previous webinars, we will focus on Kenya's PPP experience. Legal and regulatory frameworks for PPPs vary heavily on the country context, and some countries choose to regulate PPPs by passing specific laws, and other countries accommodate PPPs within existing frameworks. And while legal and regulatory frameworks enable the creation and implementation of PPPs, it's important that there is a second tier of institutions and processes, and this is what we will be talking about today. These institutions can typically help facilitate PPP implementation and also the implementation of specific laws, of regulations, and policies. In the absence of such institutions, PPPs may develop much more slowly, and also the entities entrusted with such specific roles and responsibilities under the legislation could be unable to fulfill their responsibilities appropriately. Our speakers today will walk us through the specific mechanics, the influence and quality of such second-tier institutions and processes, and also talk about how they specifically relate to the legal and regulatory framework in Kenya. Our presenter today is Dr. Nathan Rono Tuimising. Some of you might recognize him from one of our previous webinars. Most recently, he spoke about the role, the impact, and consequences of litigation in Kenyan PPPs. Welcome, Rono. Rono leads the legal function within the PPP unit of Kenya's National Treasury, where he's responsible for legal and regulatory development, for compliance, institutional support, capacity building, dispute resolution, and he supports the programmatic functions of the unit. Prior to joining the PPP unit, Rono was the deputy head of the government legal transactions within the State Law Office. Rono holds a PhD and a Master of Laws in International Economic Law from Warwick University, and also bachelor's degrees in law from Shivaji University in India. Our discussant today, we have one discussant, is Shyamala Shukla, Senior Public-Private Partnership Specialist at the World Bank Group, and she's joining us today from Accra in Ghana. Shyamala has worked at the World Bank Group for over 6 years as a consultant and as an advisor to the executive director. Shyamala has over 2 decades of experience in infrastructure financing, policy, regulation, and also extensive experience, among others, in public-private arrangements, innovative financing, and government support instruments. Shyamala was closely involved with the development and implementation of infrastructure and PPP policies in India for several years, and in various positions, and including as Director of Infrastructure within the Union Ministry of Finance. She has also worked on projects in a number of countries, including Bangladesh, Bhutan, Ghana, where she's today, Indonesia, and also in Kenya. Shyamala has an MPA from Harvard and a Master's in Finance from Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to both of you today. Our agenda will be Rono's presentation for about 25 to 30 minutes, followed by Shyamala's remarks for about 10 minutes. And as always, we highly encourage you to post your questions in the chat function. We'll be monitoring that closely, and there will be a Q&A session for about 15 minutes at the end of this webinar. And with this introduction, I will give you over to Rono.
Very good evening to everyone. I want to thank everybody for being part of this webinar conversation this evening. Very deep gratitude to the World Bank Group for these open learning campus process. I think these are very useful knowledge sharing platforms. And it's a pleasure to be sharing, reflecting upon our experience in Kenya this evening. We chose to reflect on institutional quality and how that impacts on PPP implementation in Kenya. The real issues are basically around the recognition that PPPs are process-linked processes and programs. They depend pretty much on the actions and choices of public officials, the actions and choices of private sector participants, and also multilateral development partners. And I think within the context of that vortex of engagements, there's usually a lot to do with the principles that define the mechanics of engagement, number one, and two, the norms and the standards that tend to define how public policy choices are made when it comes to what decisions need to be made with respect to any given matter at any one point in time. So for our reflection, we chose to reflect on one, the actual regulatory institutions, because in Kenya we've adopted a law on PPPs. So this legislation, the Public-Private Partnerships Act of 2013, actually creates an institutional framework of various public sector actors whose choices, whose decisions, whose actions have an impact on how the PPP program overall develops. We have the Public-Private Partnerships Committee, we have the PPP unit, we have the role of cabinet, we have the role of parliament, and we have the petitions committee. All of these bodies established in law to undertake specific functions. We also have the roles of contracting authorities. These are the procuring entities, the institutions within which public-private partnership mandates reside, and these are the people who originate specific projects for development under the PPP framework. And from an institutional perspective, the issue really is one of trust. Can we trust the public sector to make the right choices, to select the right projects? Number two, it's a question of fidelity. Will people play by the rules that are known? Third question is, will people act within the public space in a manner that is consistent, in a manner that delivers similar outcomes, applying similar principles, transaction to transaction? The question of state capability or state effectiveness. But then away from the actual physical institutions that are regulatory and project specific bodies, we also have the idea of norms, the idea of standards. And these really are the value systems, if you may, the core of what defines whether a deal in the PPP space is viable, whether a deal is something that would be seen to be attractive to the private sector, and whether the engagement space is something that delivers a sense of confidence, a sense of predictability, a sense of stability, and a sense of accountability. So the norms and standards that we will be reflecting on through the various topics of conversation today is essentially the question of the extent to which feasibility studies are bankable, and whether the transaction structures that are defined within the context of those feasibility studies are transaction structures that are understood by the market. We're talking about the principles and the norms and standards defining the system of public procurement. We're talking about accountability of public actors in terms of the decisions that they make. Can those decisions be challenged? Can those decisions be subjected to accountability? In essence, the idea or the norm and standard of justiciability of public administrative actions. We're talking about support measures that the government can bring to a deal space. So will political risks be underwritten? Will there be national-based platforms for the locking in of multilateral guarantee instruments, whether they are partial risk or full risk underwriting? Are there systems that support credit enhancement tools like export credit facilities? What is the security package that can be brought to make deals viable? And are those norms and standards that are predictable? Are those norms and standards that are capable of being subjected to assessments on affordability, sustainability? These are very important principles, I think. Then we're talking about the basic facts of contract law, because PPPs are contract-based. So the idea is, are my property rights within the context of a PPP contract document secure? Is there enforceability of accountability frameworks within the structure of the deal? Because remember, PPPs ride primarily on the basis of the performance of public functions. And so the question is about the confidence that can be brought into the whole space with respect to the performance and delivery of public services. So in other words, from a norms and standard perspective, the real issues are questions of transparency of the engagement framework and the question of predictability in those engagement frameworks. So what we are really saying is that at the core of our conversation is the idea of trust, the trust of the state. Can the state be trusted based on the whole idea of what it stands for and what it sets about to do? And then there is the idea of capability, or the state effectiveness, the ability of the state to carry through with its commitments under a transaction framework. And then, of course, the idea of enablement. Are there facilitations and systems and structures, institutional in nature, that allow for projects and project-linked processes to actually be carried through in a sustainable manner to their logical conclusion? I think to understand the context around our conversation today, it's useful to reflect on what actually has been our history. We've not always done PPPs in a regulated context, in a structured manner, as we are trying to do them today. So before 2013, when the PPP law in Kenya was adopted, there was no formal legal framework for the undertaking of PPPs. We had some regulations back in 2009, but not much happened under the context of those regulations. So pretty much before 2013, say for about 20 years, we saw probably less than 5 contracts, that were PPP linked. There was not much by way of procurement experience in terms of what was happening at the time. The issues of change management and the transition of systems from a non-regulated PPP context to a regulated PPP context has been a fairly steep curve. And so effectively what we are saying is that the context for institutional quality assessments in Kenya today is a very fluid context. It's a context that is increasingly happening. And so that transition is still nascent, still tentative. But look at where we are today. We are saying basically as a country, we now have a pipeline of 65 projects. We have a regulatory framework that is technically complete in most of the respects that a legal framework that supports PPPs could be said to basically be measured against. We have locked down 2 successful procurements. We have over 65 project-specific PPP nodes in over 35 public sector institutions. We have trained slightly over 500 public officers now in PPPs, so capacity enhancement of the public sector to undertake these transactions is on the up and up. We have 10 new procurements that are ready to go. We've got 4 projects under negotiation today, and we have 5 feasibility studies ongoing. So in a sense, while we can say that from on a scale of 1 to 10, we could say the institutional context and the normative standards framework could be said to be around between 4 and 4.5 on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being a very good framework. The country is actually learning fairly fast, and there's a lot of transition happening, right? So let's just delve into the real issues that we wanted to reflect on today. One of the very key questions that we need to think about, basing on the background that I've just laid out, is essentially the question of the quality of institutions that are mandated to select projects to actually identify the right projects that need to be brought into this space. The choices and the factors that define choice are not always very straightforward. From a practitioner's perspective, what we tend to see is that there is a bit of a struggle between, can we do it under the regular budgetary framework, and if we can't do it under the budgetary framework, should we just bump it off and do it as a PPP? So the notion of mixing between budget-based program delivery and a project that is ideal for development as a PPP is still not entirely very straightforward. So ideally, it's a question of, if we can't fund it under the budget, let's push it to PPP. So alternatives that are deemed to be equivalent, which are actually not quite what it ought to be. Questions of, why should we do a feasibility study? Feasibility studies, one, are complex, two, they're expensive, three, they are time consuming. Once we say that project is ideal for a PPP, why don't we just move on and engage the private sector and let them show us how these things should be done? So why a feasibility study is still a growing idea, and one of the things we are doing as a PPP unit is essentially to deepen the understanding of public sector entities wanting to do PPPs on the importance and value of locking down business cases and assessing a project's affordability, value for money proposition, and risk allocative efficiency. Then there is a real issue around the quality of public data. Public institutions have not always kept the right types of data in the right categories, and very frequently data sets are actually not quite available. So to even begin starting an assessment of an opportunity, looking at the embedded elements that define a potential idea, sometimes becomes a real issue. And this is more, shall we say, profiled when we are looking at social sector PPP transactions. You want to do a water project, frequently you first need to start mapping out where the pipes were laid 20, 30, 50 years ago. You want to assess issues around the quality of, let's say, water or sewer systems. You don't quite know where to begin. So sometimes finding out basic data that can inform critical choices in terms of subsequent assessment platforms can become a real issue. So these are the contexts in which we engage, and we find that therefore the question of institutional quality from that perspective becomes a real issue that needs to be progressed, something that needs to be progressively grown as our PPP experience as a country grows. It's not always very well accepted that the mandatory statutory approvals that must be obtained in a PPP value chain, from project appraisal identification to feasibility study work, approval of feasibility studies, approval of negotiated outcomes downstream, approval of program variation outcomes when we need to vary contracts. Most public sector institutions tend to look at it as bureaucracy. This is red tape. It's unnecessary, that they need to be removed sometimes. But it is an issue of capacity transition. For those MDAs that are a little further advanced in this PPP journey under the current frameworks, then the issue of why those statutory approvals are actually useful is no longer too much of an issue. But for the bulk of our public sector institutions who are beginning to transition some of their programs into this space, these are some of the questions that basically knock on our doors. And the real issues is that these considerations and the ability of public institutions to move into these spaces and begin to see these things the way they have been designed in law and in policy, is that they tend to have an impact on project selection. They have an impact on the quality of assessments, the due diligence levels that need to be brought into the project preparatory phase, which might impair the questions of value for money, questions on affordability, or assessments on what is the most optimal risk allocative efficiency that should be locked into the transaction framework, which in fact might end up either delaying the provision of public services or might impair efficient delivery of those public services. And you might end up bringing into the space transactions that are actually not suited to an output-based and performance-linked PPP transaction framework, right? Then there are issues about social license. You see in Kenya, like in most other developing countries, the growth trajectory of the state has always not been well matched by the growth trajectory of the non-state actors. And because of historical a historical lag between the pace of development, growth, and sophistication of the nation state vis-a-vis the non-state actors, there has not always been a very well calibrated, well embedded structure of open, transparent, and trusting engagement between these two platforms of human experiences. And so you find that sometimes the quality of stakeholder consultations may be an issue. Sometimes the level of thinking that is thrown into how to mitigate social license questions, whether arising from environmental concerns or social impact concerns or economic benefits dynamics around a project, sometimes may be a bit glossed over, which leads to flare-ups, tensions, conflicts, and sometimes even complete project impairment, backed up by litigation and other interventions by third parties in transaction frameworks. And these issues have an impact on and have a bearing on actually the maturity, the strength, the confidence, and the ability of public institutions to engage as efficiently and as painlessly as can be. That is an institutional issue that I think is a growing story in this country. And we have seen over the last 3 years a very interesting transition. We see a greater willingness and a greater ability to engage stakeholders when it comes to projects of this nature. And then there's a question of, we said there's an issue of justiciability and the ability of decisions to be brought to account. The question, I think, from an institutional perspective is the level of trust that the private sector brings to the space, whether there is the ability to deal with frivolous, vexatious challenges that only serve to delay processes or scuttle processes. Sometimes we see in some of our contests, and in my previous seminar, I discussed some of these issues, an outlook and a worldview of if it's not me, it's nobody else. Now, the ability of the judicial review framework or the dispute resolution mechanisms and platforms to deal with some of those issues is a fundamental question that might be seen to be definitive of the quality of institutions to actually support successful program design and delivery. Then there is a question of the consistency of public institutions with respect to the choices that they make. So in Kenya, we have a PPP law, as I've mentioned, that defines how we should be procuring PPPs. But also, side by side with that, is another regulation governing general public procurement, under which budget-based transactions are actually pursued. What we tend to see on occasion is a bit of a mix and match, and sometimes a muddling up of the two procurement platforms. So you see choices sometimes being made to pursue a PPP framework, but you find in some instances shifts. So today we're talking PPPs and therefore PPP law. Few months down the line, information out in the public domain is that the governing law for this transaction is both the public procurement legislation and the PPP law. That tends to send negative signals to the market, because then it suggests that perhaps the entity behind the transaction does not necessarily appreciate the full enormity of the conflict in the regulatory spaces. Those are issues we are dealing with in some instances. There are not many instances of those, But when they arise, they tend to suggest that there is a journey to be made. There is improvement to be locked in. The ability of project-specific bodies, the project appraisal teams, project tender evaluation bodies, project negotiation committees, to actually deal with the question of resourcing the process, ensuring that the decisions they make are decisions that are in the best interests of the project. The ability to inform those choices and access the right kind of help at the right time. The ability to leverage, for instance, sector PPP advisors, or to leverage the skill sets of transaction advisors in resolving specific issues around project preparation or project management becomes a really major question. Project management, PPPs are complex when it comes to the operational stage, as you all know. Output specifications and monitoring and enforcing those in the context of a project implementation framework can be a major issue. The question of understanding performance standards and how that is calibrated to the payment mechanisms that underpin a transaction framework can become a major challenge. And we are beginning to see, as we transition this country into a PPP contract management and contract implementation phase, that this is an area where institutional qualities are still not necessarily up to speed, and that there are things that need to be done. But it's a beautiful story that's developing, because we begin to see that there are things that are good, that are going down, and there are gaps, but those gaps are gaps that can be filled. So that is a good thing. I think at the end of the day, these three sets of issues I've just spoken to define the core question of risk in terms of how the allocated risks are best managed, how they are best mitigated, and how obligations underpinning those risks are made accountable. So shifting away from the actual institutional questions is a question of the normative standards. The first issue is really about trust in state choices. PPPs are intensely political. We have litigation internationally going on right now arising from PPP, one of our PPP transactions. We have had issues with respect to some of our project implementation processes, either from an information access perspective or from issues around whether the proposed transaction structure is environmentally friendly or whether its social impacts are sustainable, and how best those can be mitigated. The question is always about, can the state be trusted to be making the choices that are in the best interests of its people? And it starts from the issue of PPPs being public function-based programs, and therefore quite very strongly linked to public service performance and delivery. These issues can become fairly intense, especially in countries such as Kenya. There are questions about whether the state always takes into account pure project-specific considerations, or whether there are peripheral issues that tend to be brought into that space. But are choices always predictable, predicated on norms and values, or are they episodic and transient based on the ethics of the moment? Those are questions that tend to define the normative space on the question of trust in the state's choices. And there's a question of the quality of assessments on project platform. Are the transactions that are brought to the table bankable? Are the right questions being asked on viability, on sustainability, on affordability? Are risks being allocated in the right manner? And where they are allocated, is there true capacity on the parts of particularly the public sector residual risks deliverable? Is there coordination? You see, when if we take an energy sector transaction, for instance, a power purchase agreement operates as a take or pay transaction. But then the question is, there are so many other substratum rights and obligations that underpin that framework. Are there transmission lines? If there are no transmission lines, whose responsibility is it? In this country, it is the responsibility of a state agency. What about land for the project? What about the site conditions? What about issues to do with fuel delivery infrastructure? What about things to do with way leaves acquisitions? All of those are public sector residual obligations. And the question is, to what extent is there true capability to coordinate some of those issues? And in a manner that ensures that a project is deliverable and obligations can be performed in a timely manner. When we talk about procurement, the norms and standards are basically calibrated to the question of transparency, calibrated to the question of openness of the procurement process, equality of opportunity, the ability of a procurement process to be trusted with respect to the evaluation outcomes. Are the criteria understandable? Are they clear? Are they objective? Are they auditable? Is it justiciable? Can they be subjected to challenge and decision makers held to account? What about the transaction structure? Is a PPP modality a modality that is understood by the market? All of these questions have a very strong bearing from a norms and standards perspective on the question of process fidelity, on the question of the ability of third-party players in this space to rely on the decisions and choices of the public sector. It also has a very strong bearing on the clarity on the choices of PPP contractual models. Are they revenue-based? Are they risk-based? It also defines with procurement to procurement, the principles and considerations are standardized in a manner that promotes transparency of the playroom. And then, of course, there's a question of the methodology. Is it a regular competitive tender? Is it a process that is subject to competitive dialogue? Is it something that is open to unsolicited proposals and cannot be disciplined in a manner that does away with worries about questions of lack of value for money? These issues become very fundamental considerations to keep in mind from a norms and standards perspective. When you look at the last set of the norms and standards that we are discussing today, there is a question of project-specific communication standards. Now, from a norms and standards perspective, you're looking at consistency in communication, you're looking at authoritative communication, you're looking at predictable sources of information around transactions, and there have been instances where you find that statements around a project emanate from different sources and sometimes not necessarily saying the same thing over the same subject. Now, from a norms and standards perspective and from a communications, the quality of communications and the effects of those communications, that can become an issue. And it is very crucial to ensure that in a process and a framework like this, when we are building up the market framework, and I think this is a transferable lesson for jurisdictions in the place of Kenya, nascent PPP markets. This is very crucial because it has a very strong impact on exactly what happens when it comes to the ability of the international investing community to take a country seriously. We are lucky so far in this country that this has not become too much of a worry, but it is something to always look out for, especially now that this space is heating up, this space is becoming active. This is an area that, from a norms and standards perspective, will need to be monitored and managed very carefully. I think we've said a lot about process justiciability, but the focus here in the context of this slide is essentially about the quality of the decisions that emanate from administrative review tribunals and from the high courts. When faced with the same questions, is the ruling always the same? Now, we have had a number of litigation, both in the administrative review tribunals, the petition committee, and before the high court. So far, we are seeing the growth of fairly stable jurisprudence. We are seeing that over the same questions, and those are not yet many, but over the same questions, the rulings have been applying the same rationales. And so we are beginning to see a uniformity in the interpretation and application of the law, and that's a beautiful thing. I think as we expand the rollout of our programs, we'll actually begin to see a lot more of this. And I think there's an opportunity to ensure that as this space grows, it grows in a manner that entrenches the ability of market players to actually take institutions of accountability with seriousness and with trust and confidence, knowing that when they have a challenge, they can actually go before these institutions and have their matters resolved. The other question is really about the dynamics underpinning negotiations of contracts post-procurement. Our law limits the flexibility of procurements. Price variations upwards post-tender are generally not allowed in law. There are issues around the capability of public officials to negotiate. There's a question always about ensuring that public sector side obligations are coordinated and that commitments are locked in. If there are fiscal spaces to be created from the public sector perspective, if there are viability gap funding requirements or other obligations that underpin those types of arrangements, the coordinative ethic becomes a key issue that sometimes can drive suboptimal outcomes. Now, what we are looking for here in terms of norms and standards is really the question of transparency. Transparency of the overall framework of undertaking PPPs, the credibility of the process, and the level of reliance that people can place on the process of project development. Also, political stability and predictability, part of it from a communication perspective, part of it from the quality of the legal institutions that manage disputes, and accountability, where misfeasance and malfeasance can actually be subjected to censure and matters brought to a close when it comes to things not going as they should. And then, of course, overall, the principle of bankability and commerciality of transactions. So essentially, and I'm about to conclude, what we are saying is that we think and we believe that the quality of institutions have a very strong impact on effective project development. And where that capability is low, then the effectiveness of project selection becomes endangered, and therefore overall trust in the ability of the public sector to select the right types of projects to bring to this space basically dips. If the quality of our institutions, both the project preparatory institutions and the norms and standards defining the considerations that need to be brought to bear on project preparation matters, is poor, then we impair effectively a project's business case that has negative impacts on successful procurement. It may either prolong procurement timelines or basically muddle up the whole question of price discovery, or completely unravel the transaction framework. If the public institutions are weak, and then process fidelity comes into question and is impaired, because then extraneous considerations are taken into place, opportunity for corruption and other negative practices creeps in. Quality of institutions. I think our argument and our submission and our thesis tonight is essentially that this can be a definitive element in determining the extent to which a country's PPP program can be successful. And for us, we are taking some of these considerations fairly seriously. If we see repeated failures in project development and attempts to procure, then you have a real problem when it comes to questions of the trust of the investing community in a nation's capability to actually deliver the pronouncements, undertakings, and promises around a PPP. It can be a very powerful negative signal to the market. So institutional quality, in a sense, can therefore make or break a country's PPP market. And like we've said, we see and view institutions and the quality of those institutions from both the regulatory and project bodies established in law and from the perspective of norms and standards. We have suggested in our conversation tonight that Kenya's story is an increasingly beautiful story. We are increasingly locking in the right types of capabilities, the right types of considerations in terms of what we are doing, and there is room for growth. There is room for culture to be shaped and to be directed in the manner in which it should go. And therefore, we see the process transparency as a practice and quality in project preparation, as well as official fidelity to processes and efficient procurements as the foremost institutional pillars that basically can define how rapidly we can roll out our programs and achieve our aspirations as a country when we are thinking about doing PPPs. So what are we doing really to sort of lock in some of these aspirations, to sort of embed our thinking around the quality of institutions, the overall ethic of compliance regimes and ethics, and the idea of efficiency in program development. What are we doing to sort of bring these things together into a mesh of a practice, a culture, a value system, an engagement space that can be said to be defined, well-defined and understandable and clear. One is that with the support of the World Bank Group, and I'm happy that Shamla is in this conversation, we are developing a PPP disclosure framework for Kenya to improve information access, to create a better sense of transparency and accountability around what we are doing. We are increasingly encouraging and supporting our contracting authorities to use the services of qualified transaction advisors to ensure that their capacity and their capabilities around PPP project implementation are enhanced. We continually provide training opportunities for our contracting authorities and for public officials. We are amending our PPP legal framework to entrench better efficiency. So we are dealing with concerns around the bureaucracy of the process, the convoluted nature of some of the considerations that people have been feeding back on around the transaction frameworks in the PPP legal framework. We are redefining the territories and boundaries of institutional mandates, separating policy organs from project-specific organs and from regulatory institutions. We are redefining the framework for county PPP transactions. Counties are subnational entities in Kenya under the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And so we are reframing the PPP law to make it more functional, and this is informed by practice. We are also strengthening PPP institutions. We are providing training to our petition committee, which is a tribunal established to deal with PPP disputes. We are strengthening the PPP committee, which is the approving institution for PPPs, the regulator of PPPs in Kenya. We are providing capacity enhancements. We are building up the capacity of the PPP unit, expanding our numbers, and also continually accessing knowledge events such as this to improve our skill sets. And we are placing an awful amount of emphasis on the question of procurement fidelity, the rigor and standardization of tools. We are investing an awful amount of time in ensuring that these things actually do come together. So in a sense, we are saying that we are placing a premium on growing high quality institutions, both regulatory bodies as well as the normative standards. I want to thank you very much for listening, and over to you, Rupi.
Thank you, Rono. Great comprehensive overview of Kenya's PPP institutions and where they have been doing well, where there's room for improvement. Before we move into the discussion, I'll hand over. Rona, we've received a lot of questions actually even before this webinar, so there's a lot of interest in this topic. Perhaps since you mentioned it at the very end, you talked about procurement and the importance of being very rigorous with the approach to procurement. There was a question about benchmarking and the possibility of benchmarking institutional quality, perhaps procurement in Kenya. Are there measures in place that you can talk about?
Yes, there are a number of things that we're doing. I think one is we have done an exercise in terms of, and this is in response really to the statements and reflections of public institutions that have been engaging in this business. And there has been a question of what is more efficient, the systems defining public procurement or the systems defining PPP procurement. And one of the things that we have done is to do a benchmark exercise of the two systems. We know that these are not apples to apples comparisons, but these are public procurement systems, and from a public choice perspective, that has been one. But we have also spent time looking at practices in South Africa. We've looked at practices in a few other jurisdictions outside of Africa that are in more or less the space we are in and a little advanced. We've looked at some of the best institutions and jurisdictions around the world on what they are doing, the systems they are applying. We have had exchange visits. We have had bilateral exchanges, and we are trying to do an element of exposure of our systems to those of other jurisdictions to try and then benchmark precisely where we are and what we could be doing better to achieve better outcomes. So it's an ongoing exercise.
Cabot asked in the chat box a question about institutional quality at the subnational level. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, what institutions are in place at the subnational level and perhaps what can be done in the short, or what are the priorities in the short term versus long term. And I'll just add another question that was also posted before this webinar about PPP institutions and political influence. This really relates to something you said in the very beginning, one of the core ideas of trust.
Yes.
How about you talk a little bit about how to implement more trust and really create confidence for investors and lenders?
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Rupi. Good questions. First, at the subnational level, when we talk about PPP institutions at the subnational level, we are talking about the county PPP nodes. What we have done is to establish PPP nodes in counties. PPP nodes are a body established by the PPP Act of 2013 as the overall policy organ for defining and identifying and preparing PPP projects for the subnational entities. And in this context, I choose to say subnational entities and equate them to county governments. We have state-owned enterprises at the national government level, which would generally also qualify as subnational entities. But at the national government level, the same administrative and regulatory ethic that governs contracting authorities would govern state-owned enterprises at the national government level. For county governments, which are the true subnational entities in this context, we have PPP nodes, and we also support county governments in resourcing project appraisal teams that work in close coordination with the national PPP unit to ensure that projects are identified, they are selected, they are supported, they are prepared, and they are managed as they are required to be managed under law. One of the things that then we are doing at the PPP unit is that we have a dedicated county PPP team that works directly with county governments and their institutions for PPPs at those spaces to ensure that processes are seamless in operations. It is a growing space, and we actually do believe that the subnational PPP space in Kenya is going to be a lot more active than the national PPP space, just by the sheer number and the very huge interest that county governments have demonstrated on PPPs. On the second question, there is it's an interesting conversation. Political influence on matters of institutional quality and how that perhaps could be improved is always a very interesting conversation. We do not say in Kenya we have political interference. We always say politicians give us input. The input sometimes is too much, it might be a little less, depending on the context, but the whole idea is that PPPs from a political influence perspective, as I said earlier, are fairly intense. And so there's always a question of a timing mismatch. Politics and PPPs do not necessarily have a similar worldview. In politics, there is a cyclical outlook when you're looking at the electioneering circles, and in countries in the development context of Kenya, these are significant events. And so you are looking at a desire to lock down certain outcomes within a very short and very well-defined political time phase, while on the other hand, the depth of rigor and the requirements for assessment of transactions and the process of developing them, bringing them to market and getting them implemented, may actually transcend political circles. So you have issues of a timing mismatch. But we are doing a lot of engagement with our political leaders. We are doing a lot of engagement with our contracting authorities. And we report to Cabinet on the status of our progress in terms of PPP project implementation. And we try to synchronize expectations. And it is becoming better. The engagement space is becoming better in this country. And we are beginning to see with our political class and our leaders, more or less the same outlook in terms of what this program is potentially capable of delivering and the time implications that need to be brought to bear. So again, like I say, it is a growing relationship, it's a deepening of understanding, it's an expansion of the overall appreciation of the rigors and ethics of PPP project implementation. And we think that 2-3 years down the line, from today, we'll be talking about a very different story. Over to you, Rupi.
Thank you, Rono. We'll continue with the Q&A session.
So we are almost at the end of the webinar. I'll just say a few words and then we can probably go back to question and answer or end the webinar depending on the time. I felt this was a great presentation by Rono, and Kenya has actually been very progressive on the PPP front in terms of looking at all of the aspects which go into the making of a good PPP program. And as we all know, social, political, and economic development aspects probably determine, institutional quality. And quality, when you look at it in terms of predictability and the working of institutions as well, as well as in their effectiveness. So on the one side is the predictability, and on the other side is whether you are achieving the objectives that you set out to achieve in the first place. And a lot of this depends on, those determinants of institutional quality. And what do you call institutional quality? Basically, it's the governance framework. And when you talk about the governance framework, it's again coming back to clarity, predictability, legitimacy of institutions on the one hand, and on the other hand, authorities probably need to have the resources and skills to make all of these institutions work. And PPPs, as you know, need to follow a very structured process, which is very well laid out with a VFM, with a with projects being fiscally responsible projects in which the risks are either minimized or well managed, and with the integrity of processes, procurement processes, and all other processes. So, like Rono described, on the one hand, you have the policy and law, which set the wider or the larger framework, and within that you have regulations, guidelines, processes, methodologies. Methodologies are very important. How you do the VFM, how you do the CBA, how do you do the fiscal risk management? How do you value your guarantees? How do you report them? All of these become very important in the context of PPPs. And finally, like Rono mentioned, the standards. What standards are you looking at? And those standards should, you cannot have these standards or methodologies in vacuum. You have to look at everything that is happening, the stage at which you are in terms of your PPP projects. What are you trying to deliver? In terms of those, you have to set your standards. And finally, resource and skills are actually the most important ones. And in the case of Kenya, what has made the whole process more complicated, however, the government of Kenya is actually, rising to the challenge. I feel the greatest challenge at this point in time is that there are multiple stakeholders. The PPP unit and everything that goes with the state, it is kind of very well prepared in terms of the skills on the one hand, as well as laying out these processes and methodologies very clearly. But you have so many institutions now. You have the county governments coming up, the counties coming up, so those projects will start flowing. So how do you ensure that these also rise to the same standard that you have for the national government and whatever structures have been built there? How do you kind of replicate similar structures? I wouldn't say the same structures, but similar structures at the county level and make them perform. And then you have the domestic market. You have private sector institutions also in this, the financiers, the developers who come in. How do you ensure the same standard understanding in the private entities as well? So it's a very complicated process, and the government of Kenya has been thinking of all of these. The PPP unit has been braced to face all of these various challenges that are coming up. So the multiplicity of institutions involved in the PPP process is something they are now looking at and thinking of creating a whole capacity building program for the private sector as well, and which we are also discussing with them. And Bruno mentioned disclosure. Disclosure is something which is very close to our hearts. Everyone who's been through the PPP process, we know that transparency ultimately, you put out whatever you are doing and it's under the public gaze, then there's always a pressure for you to perform even better. So that helps in various ways. Not only does it help in your communication and to gain the trust of the public, it also works on you because you want to ensure the quality. You want to be seen as a quality institution, a quality government, or a quality PPP unit. So in those terms, it works both ways. And I feel it's a very important consideration in PPP programs all over the world, because we have seen beautiful frameworks, not working just because, the institutions lack quality or the capability to carry these frameworks forward. So it's a whole amalgam of different issues or different factors or variables going into making quality institutions. Thank you so much, Rupi, and back to you.
Thank you, Shyamala. I'm glad we're able to connect after all. We will go a little over time since we started slightly late, and I'll address a couple more questions to the two of you. Maria Velarde asked a question about the mechanics of the PPP unit. Rono, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the main functions of the unit along the PPP lifecycle. Where does the PPP unit at the national level step in? Perhaps a little bit about members and capacity. And then we have another question from Olayemi about M&E, monitoring and evaluation, and the state or the national level capacity to do so. Perhaps you can give an example of a PPP and how, in that case, success and whether goals and targets were reached and achieved, how that was measured.
Okay. Thank you very much. Rupi, Shyamala, thank you for those very useful reflections. The PPP unit is engaged 100% in the entire PPP value chain, right from project inception to contract monitoring. We, by law, are required to support contracting authorities in the process of project selection. We work as the technical arm to the PPP committee, so we prepare the technical working papers, basically assessments and recommendations to the committee on the acceptability or non-acceptability of proposed project idea as a PPP potential idea. We backstop the PPP feasibility study preparatory process. So we sit alongside contracting authorities in the project appraisal teams. We task manage transaction advisors. We help contracting authorities in defining terms of reference for engagement of TAs. We also support in quality assuring the work of transaction advisors. We are involved deeply in procurement phases of a transaction. We engage bidders in the context alongside contracting authorities in tender processes. We help contracting authorities respond to bidder concerns. When we need to do competitive dialogue processes, which are fairly complex as a procurement methodology, we design the procurement, the competitive dialogue mechanisms and the rules of engagement. We resource the engagement processes. We support with contract negotiations, tender evaluations. We help contracting authorities design contract management frameworks. So by law, we are designed as the technical arm and the center of expertise for PPPs. And in terms of the structure of the PPP unit, we are structured along project functions. I head the legal function. We have somebody, an engineer, heading the technical services of the unit. We have a financial expert heading the financial aspects of the unit. We have financial modelers within the unit. We are hiring financial analysts to backstop the financial angle to the unit. We have a safeguards specialist. We have a procurement specialist and a function under each of those specialized functions. We have a communications person in charge of overall PPP communications, and both from the unit and from the perspective of contracting authorities. We also have economists to help with the economic analysis and assessment of transactions. These are cross-cutting functions. We have a monitoring and evaluation function. So the unit is really designed across project disciplines, and we work as a team. We are therefore a fairly multidisciplinary team. The head of the unit is a civil engineer, Engineer Stanley Kamau. So the unit is really, shall we say, a port of expertise in terms of the various mandates that are required to be brought to bear in terms of transactions. And the second question, Drupi, was on. Could you restate the second question?
Yes, of course. The second question was about monitoring and evaluation. If you could perhaps illustrate using an example how the process works within the unit.
Okay. Our monitoring and evaluation function actually cuts across both our programmatic functions in terms of what we do to backstop processes within the unit, and monitoring and evaluation on the project side of things, what contracting authorities do and throughout the process of a project cycle. So internally, we monitor our milestones in terms of project development. If we are hiring transaction advisors, our monitoring and evaluation framework, it basically monitors the various milestones that need to be achieved with respect to that process. And we use traffic lights as a mechanism to ensure that actions and status of processes are properly marked. If things are falling behind schedule, we always use red. If things are on course but delayed, we use amber. If things are on time and achieved within time, the timelines, they are always marked with green. And we have regular monthly review meetings to ensure that actions and functions are happening as they ought to be happening. We have more or less had, I think, overall about 60–70% on target delivery on some of the things that we are doing, and I think that is a growing ethic. In the early days, things were slow, and we were often behind schedule until we started locking in our M&E systems. And when that happened, and the regular monitoring mechanisms were made a part and parcel of the institutional framework, things began happening a lot faster. And I think we are reaping the benefits now. Now, secondly, from a project side perspective, the M&E function has demonstrated that where things sit stagnant for a long time, in one of the transactions, we discovered that programs were not moving as they should have been moving because things were stagnant at one point for a long period of time. Our M&E function began to understand what was going on, and once we started walking into that space, we discovered that decision-making processes were not as good as they ought to have been, and we identified areas that required intervention. And so decision-making interventions were provided. In other instances, it was issue about resourcing the processes to move from one step to the next. In other instances, it was purely administrative inefficiency. And the more we picked up some of those issues, a transaction that had been stagnated for pretty much over 6 months started locking progress, and things began moving. So the M&E function is beginning to demonstrate that if applied well, then both the levels of efficiency and effectiveness of the unit and contracting authorities can continually increase. Over to you, Rupi.
Shyamala, would you like to add something, perhaps to the M&E experience from other countries that you've had, or even to the mechanics of the PPP unit?
Yeah, one concern which I wanted to share here in terms of not just Kenya, but countries which are working so hard to put in this whole web of law, policy, methodologies, standards, processes, and M&E frameworks on the one hand, procurement processes on the other, and it's a whole very well laid out and structured, I would say structured web. And the challenge now would be in terms of ensuring quality is to let these things evolve, because none of these will be stationary. Things will be moving, as Kenya has seen in the case of the counties coming up. While they were, they had the new law and they were trying to do this, instantly this whole issue of subnational governments came up. So the challenge now would be, as they, perfect everything, would be to ensure that all of these institutions are able to move, evolve, and adjust to the moving times. The market will move, many stakeholders will move, the county governments will become more capacitated in course of time. So the issues that will come up and the problems and the challenges that will come up will be very different. So that is something they should ensure, how to keep enough flexibility in everything that they're building so that it is able to move forward very well, including M&E frameworks, because how you start on a basic level, the issues that you have to deal with at a more sophisticated level would be very different. So that's one of my concerns in regard to all PPP programs and the Kenyan one as well.
Thank you, Shyamala. In the interest of time, I will ask for concluding remarks, if you would like to share any. Perhaps, Rono, if you would like to talk about some of the challenges that you see. Shyamala mentioned hers earlier, related to the fact that there are multiple stakeholders, multiple institutions that have to live up to a certain standard. Feel free, please, to share your concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. Allow us to thank everyone for joining us today. I think it's useful to reflect on some of this. I have benefited immensely from some of the comments from the participants. I see a lot of observations, a lot of questions, and I think those reflections are useful in expanding our thinking processes. One of the key challenges from where I sit is not too dissimilar from what Shyamala has raised. You see, the more we build up the engagement platforms, the more we define systems, standards, codes of practice, guidelines, benchmarks, and all of these things, they are almost appearing as it is now, that there is what shall we say, an avalanche, an overflow, a sort of a torrent of these issues, and the capacity to assimilate all of these issues, translate them into institutional practice, is something that is going to be a little bit of a challenge. So we do believe that these standards, these norms, these approaches that we are looking in are useful approaches, they are strategic approaches, they are value adding, but they are many. So the real challenge is ensuring that there is effectiveness in the manner in which they are actually implemented, and that we can incrementally lock in higher and higher efficiency systems in ensuring that these things actually work together. But like we say, this is a growing story, and it's delightful to be part of this story. Thank you. Over to you, Shamala.
Thanks, Rono. Yeah, it's a growing story. It's an evolving story, and hopefully, we'll be seeing, like, at the perfection lies in having institutional quality, even in the absence of too many guidelines. So we will move towards that. Initially, in every program, we need to have all of this because people do not know, officials do not know how they should handle a certain piece of work or a certain situation. We were discussing in Ghana today. We were discussing disclosure actually, and disclosure in public-private partnerships. So a person who came out in the middle of the conversation said, all of this is fine. I'm really willing to do all of this, but sometimes I don't know, how to do it, how to do a lot of these things. I don't understand what is, confidential information. I don't understand what I should do in terms of the process and in terms of, what to disclose, how to do it, what is the timing. So these are things which, bewilder us initially when we set out for a structured program. And we need all of this huge, complexity of laws and guidelines. But the perfection in this and the success in this probably lies in, as we, proceed, as we progress, to minimize many of these and to internalize many of these, so that governance becomes not a web of all of these guidelines, but something which comes out of government institutions. But I think we have very far to go in that. Thank you, Rupi.
Thank you very much, Roman Shamala. I think despite the technical difficulties, this was a very, very informative and well-structured conversation. Thank you to our audience for joining this fifth webinar in the PPPs in Sub-Saharan Africa series. Would like to ask you to please fill out the webinar feedback form, which will appear on your screens shortly. Please take the time to do that. The recording will be available 24 hours from now. And please also join us for the next webinar, which will be on October 25th on financing and funding Kenyan PPPs. We hope you will join us again. Thank you and see you soon.